Hello, everyone. My name is Sydney, and this is my contrastive analysis of the English and French languages. So we're going to go through several different topics in this presentation, starting with just a general history of the origins of these languages. Then we're going to analyze them. So comparatively, we will discuss the basic features of English language like phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. We'll also cover some discourse varieties. There's quite a few to discuss. We will compare and contrast the components of each language system as we go throughout this presentation, and we will discuss several difficulties that native French speakers may have when learning English. And then we'll finish up discussing things that are a little bit less concrete, like communication rules, nonverbal behaviors, the things that you kind of learn and understand subconsciously about communicating in that given language. So we're going to go ahead and get started. C'est parti. We're going to discuss the history or l'histoire. So about French. So it has a few different origins, as many languages do. We'll uncover that, English just the same. English actually drew quite a bit from French, which is why they're not the most difficult languages to transition between. But when Gaul was conquered by the Romans in the late 1st century, early 2nd century, we saw the first glimpse of the French language. So Gaulish dialects died out pretty quickly due to Romans essentially requiring everyone to speak the way that they did, which is why French is considered a Romance language. But around 150 words lingered on and wove their way into the Latin language that they were meant to speak. Then all of these things kind of mix together. So we have some Latin roots, some Gaulish roots, and dialects that turned into the French language. And that is why French has such clear Latin roots, but remains very different and being its own language. And then this is another reason why English has a lot of Latin roots, because although it didn't literally come directly from Latin, we drew a lot from languages like French that have very strong Latin roots. So we've got a couple examples of where our Gaulish roots can be seen and our Latin roots can be seen. So we see the French aller, which means to go. This comes from the Gaulish allu. And then cervoise, which is like beer, kind of like in Spanish. A lot of people know the term cerveza. You can see those kind of overlaps with the Romance languages. So this came from cervecía. And then in Old English, although it came mainly from like Latin, Celtic, French, Scandinavian, modern English has a lot to credit toward French in terms of what types of words we use. There's a lot of overlap, a lot of cognates when you look at English versus French. Modern English is also mainly rooted in German and Dutch, but is truly a tossed salad of words, just like we say about the American culture, very much a tossed salad. And then looking at our Latin roots, we've got words like facile, which means easy, which would come from the Latin word facilis. French partir, which means to leave, comes from the Latin partire. And then once again, although English is not actually of Germanic roots, it has borrowed many roots and words from Latin. So now let's get into our analysis, since we have a little bit of history under our belts. Starting with some discourse varieties. So as you can see, French is spoken in lots of different places. French in France is the type that we're going to be looking at throughout this presentation, but we also have French from Marseille. The main differences here are that pronunciation of each syllable is more clear and that is used as an add-in to sentences. We have French in Belgium. There are many differences in grammar and pronunciation due to Dutch influence. French in North America, like Canada. Very similar to Parisian French in writing, but some differences in pronunciation, as that tends to happen. French in Louisiana, also known as Creole. It's a little bit of a mixture of French and African languages. French in Algeria, mostly French, but Arabic words are sprinkled throughout, and the Arabic pronunciation and accent are very much more prevalent than the French pronunciation and French accent. French in Congo, this is again a mix of French and a few local languages. Sounds quite a bit different than pure French. You may not recognize it right away. And then finally, we'll discuss French in Switzerland. There are some minor differences, mainly that French is spoken slower in Switzerland, but other than that, it's pretty much the same grammatically as well as with pronunciation. And then here's a few English discourse varieties. So the English in America is mainly what we're using right now to compare to French. Then we have English in England, many differences in spelling, accent, slang, grammar, and pronunciation. Those are probably the most common differences we see with discourse varieties in English. English in Canada, also known as North American English. Pretty much the main differences are spelling. They tend to double up the consonant. We don't like the double L's in words that American English would not do, but otherwise very, very similar. English in Australia follows pretty much all of the same rules as England English with a slightly different accent. Sort of similar with New Zealand, but we also see some Maori influence, which is our like native language. And then we have English in South Africa, often omits the final consonant of words, but other than that, we don't see a huge difference. And then finally, English in India, very, very similar, but some pronunciation is often different due to accent and just the local languages kind of finding their way in there. So now we'll get into phonology. So this is the French alphabet. We've got A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. Here you go, little tune for you. That's the French language alphabet. Pretty much exactly the same as English. We just have different pronunciations when it comes to the letters. Into phonology a little bit more. French phonology is characterized by great changes in the sounds of words as compared with their Latin parent forms, as well as cognates in other Romance languages. Pretty much the same can be said about English. English and French use the exact same 26-letter alphabet, but English has over 44 phonemes and French only has about 36. So I've got a quick little detour here for us to take a look at some of these extensive amounts of phonemes. We've got these consonant phonemes, quite a few, as you can see here. We'll scroll nice and slowly so you can take a look. And there are also certain sounds that exist in French that don't exist in English, and we'll address those here and there. And then we've got lots of vowel sounds. Lots and lots of vowel sounds in English, not necessarily as many in French. And then I've got another little visual for seeing kind of this like transition and these cognates. So we've got, the Latin word securum, Spanish seguro, French sur, Latin vocem, Spanish voz, French voix. So you can see the transition pretty clearly when you're comparing the different languages. So now we're getting into phonemes. French phonemes, we're starting with vowels, just to kind of break it down a little bit more. And we see a lot of these sounds in English, but a couple of them I've highlighted, we do not see in English. So we do see this, the I kind of representing an E sound. So we've got V, D, stylo, that means writing utensil in French. But then we also have like the light E sound, the soft E that we also see in English. So fait, et, danser, the eh sound. But we also have a couple, like I said, that we don't have in English. So as we look through these, we get to this one right here, which is one of those sounds that is very common in French, and one that we tend to associate heavily with French because of the shape your mouth has to make in order to form it. We really associate English with like making large movements with our mouths in order to form our words. Like, as you can see my mouth as I'm speaking in English, it's a little bit more expressive, whereas when I'm speaking in French, it's going to be a little bit tighter. So with these words and this sound, it's the v, oofs sound. Oofs means eggs in French, fun fact. So you see, you have to kind of make your mouth nice and tight in order to form these words. Same right here. This is a violon, a sol, professeur. You see, we have to make our mouths shaped a little bit differently in order to form those words, and that's why we really don't see that in English, because we don't have that mouth shape as a common occurrence, and we don't have these phonemes for vowels. But we have a lot of these other ones. We have, kind of the hard O, so faux, maître, beau, very similar. We have sol, pomme, kind of a similar sound, slightly different enough to have the distinction there, and so on and so forth as you look through these different phonemes. And now here are English vowels. As you can see, there's definitely some overlap. We've got the E sound, sheep, that we make, this is defined or labeled with the I, but usually we see it with the double E. But we also have words that use the I in that respect in our language as well. We've got the oo sound that's not super common in this form. We don't see like the double O very commonly to make that sound in French, but we do see that sound occurring in French. Same thing with shoot, that U sound. Again, we don't usually see the double O, but we do have that sound, and so on and so forth. So now we've got kind of a breakdown of our nasal vowels versus our semi-vowels. This is how they're categorized. So our nasal vowels really require you to use like your sinuses in order to form those words. So if we start right up here, this sound is pronounced as ga, va, ba. You really have to use your nose. Same thing with like une, parfum, chacun. You've got that nasal sound right there. And then our semi-vowels are slightly different. And they all kind of sound similar, but they're distinguished from one another. So we've got oui, nuit, lui. You see, we start with that tight lip, and then we kind of spread it into a smile. Same thing with oui or moi. And then you, Dieu. You see those little small mouth shapes that you have to make for a lot of these phonemes is one of like the main characteristics of the French language. And that's why we tend to associate, those motions and those movements with the French language. And then here we have a chart of lots of different phonemes in English, but we're just going to put our attention on this bottom part, looking at our consonants. So we can see there's definitely overlap in the sounds that are, spoken in French as well as English. You can really see kind of how we derive our words from French and other languages, but there are also sounds that we don't really have in French, like the ch sound is not very common in French. You usually have it sound more like a sh, like we saw with chacun, that was a CH, but we don't pronounce it ch. It's too harsh. And then thin and that, those two sounds are also, ones that are often seen as, specific to English, but we don't really see that in French either. We sometimes will see the kind of vibration sound that we make with TH in French, but rarely will we see the th sound. And then we see the sh sound very often in French, as well as the zh sound. We see the uvular fricative that we'll talk about a little bit more as we progress, but there's definitely a lot of overlap with our phonemes. As we can see, these are our French consonant sounds. So just like in English, we've got the p sound for plague or public. We've got the b sound, just the same. Bon, bêtise, bateau, all of those sounds. Same with T, D, very, very similar across the board. And then we do have that z sound, the zh sound. We can see right here, génial, like I mentioned, but we don't really see the th sound anywhere on here. So that's definitely a common difference. And then this is another one that's found only in French. On genoux, poignet, the ng sound is very common in French, but not common in other languages. And then these are some Americanized phonemes that are commonly used in French, so they don't necessarily use like the French translation for the words camping and smoking. So you get that ng sound. And then we're going to break down some morphemes. So we've got English morphemes to start us. These are just a few examples. Of course, there are many, many morphemes. So we have, the ER or EST affix in order to indicate comparatives or superlatives. So for example, they're cooler than we, indicating that they're significantly more cool than we are. He's the strongest student, indicating that there's no one stronger. We have the ED affix to indicate past tense. So I shared my drink. We have un as a prefix on verbs as well as in adjectives to indicate some sort of negation. So I'm unhappy today means that I'm not happy. I wish I could undo that mistake. So we can see this, like I said, with verbs and adjectives. Then we have the affix of able. We attach this to verbs. It's a little far away, but walkable, we can see we're turning it into a way to describe how easily you can get to and from. The marker is removable with water, kind of turning it into a descriptor. And then we have bound versus free. You can see I kind of explain these right here. Like these are bound morphemes because they cannot necessarily stand alone and have a meaning, whereas able is a free morpheme because able in and of itself is a word. And when we add it on to words, it can, create new meanings. But some other examples of bound morphemes on the S affix or suffix, the RE, prefix, ER, EST, so on and so forth. And then some free ones that we can tack onto words are things like boy, act, tour, talk, all that good stuff. Then we have our French morphemes. So I'm giving some examples of sort of affixes here, some that go on the end, some that sometimes you can find in the middle. We'll look at some examples and then I've got some translations over here. So ons is a first person plural suffix. So saying nous partons would mean we leave or we are actively leaving. Then we can see the ir, nous partirons, nous partions, nous partirions, all have different meanings in terms of verb tense, but generally mean like we will leave, we were leaving, we would be leaving. So we can see that the E also indicates pastness. So adding in that E sound, nous partions means that we were leaving. Maybe we're staying now. And nous partirions would be we would be leaving. So it kind of brings in a little new meaning. And then we have the IR, which indicates future. So nous partirons would be we will leave. And then nous partirions would be we would be leaving, as I mentioned before. And then some more French morphemes, prefixes like auto, contra, ex, foi, auprès, all have their own meanings. So prefix meaning of auto would be by itself, by oneself, which is, just the same in English. So for example, the term autobiographique, there we go. Still brushing up on my French. And that would translate to autobiography. Contra, very similar to like contrary, as we know contra usually means opposite or some sort of negation. So contra means opposite of not. And we see contraire, which would mean contrary, very, very similar. Ex, FOU, outside of. So exomer would be to exhume something. Again, these are all, very close cognates to English. And then pre would be before. Préhistoire would be prehistoric or prehistory. Then just some more for us. We've got able, like we mentioned in English. Again, there's a lot of overlap because we derive a lot of our language from French. So this would mean able or capable of. Agréable would be agreeable, an agreeable person. Ice or is would indicate nationality. So that kind of varies across the board depending on language. But for example, française is how you would refer to a French person. Like you would say, je suis français, I am French. And then is usually used in terms of adjectives. So it's like a characteristic. So chaude would be hot. Oh, il est très chaud. It's very hot. And then il est, or et means like small. So we see this, similarly in Spanish, like ito, oh, muy piquito, or, mi abuelita would mean like, oh, my sweet grandmother, my little grandmother. Very similar concept in French. So this means like small, little, smaller, cute is usually when we use that. So, maigrelet or roulet would be skinny and an alley, like a narrow, small space. And then we have the uvular fricative that I mentioned before. So English doesn't have this sound, but it's very, very prominent in French. So we see the française, that sound is the uvular fricative. Arrondissement would be a borough. If you've ever heard of the arrondissements in France, they're like circularly set up neighborhoods. Sucre, sugar, frère, brother, rondronner, super, very much fitting in terms of how the word is pronounced. So this is a sound that many English speakers struggle with when learning French, sort of like the rolled R in Spanish that English speakers have a lot of difficulty with, because we really don't have these types of sounds in our language. It's a little bit more straightforward, at least from our perspective, of course, because it's our native tongue. But we also see people who are native speakers of French, struggle to, eliminate that sound from their language. And then these are some sounds that can be very tough for French speakers when they're learning English. So the th sound, like I said, doesn't really exist in French. So when learning English, many French speakers will read the th as a s or a z sound. So instead of saying this, we'll hear this, that's how a lot of people like mimic the French accent by putting a z instead of any th sounds, because it can be very challenging. The h sound is pretty much never pronounced in French, never enunciated. So a lot of times French speakers will drop the H sound when speaking English and have a hard time forming it. So instead of saying hat, they may say at. So, from our perspective, it's almost like they're switching the letters around, but it's just because that H sound doesn't really exist for them. And then vowel sounds, French speakers will often replace English vowel sounds with French ones. So most of our vowels have multiple pronunciations like we were discussing previously. So that can be kind of hard to grasp, especially coming from a language where that's not really the case. So words like ship would often be pronounced as sheep because the I sound doesn't really exist in French. It's not common. And as we've seen, there are many cognates between French and English. Many English words are derived from the French language, so it is certainly not the most challenging transition in the world. Kind of like transitioning from Spanish to French, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of things that you can draw on from your knowledge of one language and apply to the other. But the transition can be challenging mostly with like just pronunciation. But cognates are definitely super common in these languages, so that can be helpful in making sense of things. So let's talk syntax, sentence structure. So French and English are similar in a lot of ways. French and English are different in a lot of ways. So for example, French syntax generally follows the same order that we do in terms of subject, then verb, then object. So for example, j'aime mes élèves. So that would mean I love my students. I love is j'aime, and then my students is mes élèves. And then we've got some differences. Pretty typical, but there are exceptions in syntax order. So for example, we often see French put the adjective after the noun, whereas we pretty much always in English put the adjective before the noun. So for example, in French, we would say le chien mignon, which would translate directly to the dog cute. In English, we would say the cute dog, but it has the same meaning. Then we have semantics. So an important part of semantics is how we negate things in French. So for example, je ne sais pas, usually pronounced je ne sais pas, kind of just putting it all together. And that translates directly to I don't know. So a lot of times you hear that in French class. Je ne sais pas, I don't know. In French, n'est pas means not. So that's like how we negate things, is with those two words. And it always goes around the verb. So as you can see, ne comes before c'est, which is the verb of to know. And then pas would be after, indicating you don't know. So it might translate directly to, I do know not, in a more literal sense, as we see right here. Another example, je ne crois que, pronounced je ne crois que, kind of all putting it into one word. And in the English, we say, I don't believe that. Je ne crois que would be, I don't believe that in our language. But again, literally, it would translate to, I do believe not that. So ne que and ne pas are always interpreted as negations and are a big part of the language and not super difficult to learn. Especially as English language speakers, we have lots of conjunctions like don't and stuff like that. So it's not the most challenging transition there. Then we have determiners, so words that introduce and modify nouns. They always come before the noun and they follow gender rules, which we don't really have in English. So for example, un or une is a, Le or les is the, and de or du would be some. So you can see we've got a definitive, an indefinite, and then a imperative. In English, we do the same thing. We just, like I said, don't really use gender rules for all nouns like Romance languages do. So the and a are used to introduce pretty much every noun. There's a pencil on the floor, bring me the note cards. And then here's some other words and their classifications. So we've got some adverbs of time. Maintenant, which means now, and enfin, which would be finally. Adverbs of place. Ici is here. Partout would be everywhere. Adverbs of manner. Bien, well, lentement, slowly. Adverb of frequency. Jamais, never. Toujours, always. And then adverbs of quantity. Beaucoup, a lot. Or peu, a little. You know, a lot of times people will ask, oh, tu parles français, which means, do you speak French? And you say, un petit peu, which means a tiny little bit, which is what I've got. Un petit peu, if you can't tell. And then we have some adjective examples. So some demonstrative adjectives. Cette would be this. C'est would be those. Quel is what, like what a day. So it's like an exclamative. And then we've got quelle, which would be what in a less excitable way. Choc would be each. This is an indefinite adjective. Certain, certain. And then we have some possessives. Votre, which is yours. Miss, my. And then relative, je would be I. And again, these are just a few examples. Of course, there are lots of other words in the language and lots of other morphemes and, you know. So verb tenses are also a big aspect, of course, of any language. In French, we have the present tense. I'm eating now. Je mange maintenant. The passé composé, which is the past tense. Je fais mes devoirs hier soir. I did my homework last night, so I already did something. L'imparfait, the imperfect tense. So we're saying they studied at the university for 4 years. Et étudiant à l'université pendant 4 ans. Pardon my pronunciation. Le futur, the future tense. J'irai en France la semaine prochaine. I will go to France next week. Le conditionnel, the conditional tense, so present conditional, I would eat the apple if it were right. Je mangerai la pomme si elle était mûre. And then past conditional, j'aurais mangé la pomme si elle avait été mûre. And then we have le subjunctif, the subjunctive tense, sorry. I'm in my classroom thinking test. I wish him to come with me. You know, saying I wish or I hope, stuff like that. And then le passé simple, the simple past or the preterite tense is usually a more common phrase. She saw her brother approaching. Elle vit son frère l'approcher. So those are our tenses. And tenses, we all have all of these in English. So let's talk about la culture. So culture influences conversation. This is pragmatics, more or less. And France is described as a coconut culture, which we'll get into a little bit more. But essentially, a coconut culture is more of a how we perceive French people as being outsiders of that culture. So colloquialisms that are commonly used in conversation in lieu of more formal versions, because usually when you're taking a class, you learn the very formal versions. But these are the more commonly used colloquial phrases. So, j'ai le dalle. Instead of j'ai faim or j'ai très faim, j'ai le dalle is I'm really hungry. Dans la coin. Instead of au coin de la rue, you know, to say, oh, it's around the corner of the street. Dans la coin means around the corner. Ça déchire. Instead of c'est génial, ça déchire is that's awesome. Ça fait chier, instead of words like énervante or ennuyeux. Ça fait chier literally means something similar to how we would use the word like crappy, but is often used as the context of something being annoying or boring. So saying like, oh, this class is so crappy, basically is what they're saying. And then grève, instead of sérieuse or oui totalement or folle, grève, you know, basically means serious. Yes, totally. Or it can mean that someone is a little crazy. So a few different meanings there. And now to talk about the coconut culture. So coconut culture, like I said, has a lot to do with like outsiders' perception of this culture. We see France as a coconut culture, especially as Americans, because we're a peach culture, which means Americans tend to be really friendly and open with strangers right away, sharing personal things, trying to get to know them. You know, talking to somebody in the checkout line at the grocery store is a pretty common occurrence in America. Whereas in France, they're coconut culture. So they kind of have a harder outside shell, but soft, sweet inside, just like in America. So French people tend to be more closed off towards strangers, but warm and friendly once the barrier has been taken down. They don't feel a need to form, meaningful connections with random strangers on the street, which I totally respect. So French people tend to be also very direct in their communication, very straightforward, no beating around the bush, which is something that's very common in Americans' peach culture because we're soft and squishy on the outside and on the inside. So we're sensitive, prone to bruising. And so we're very careful about how we phrase things to one another. Whereas in France, not as touchy, they've got that hard outer shell, or they can take it. So they tend to be more direct in their speaking. And we can see right here, this is just kind of a chart of peach culture versus coconut culture and how after a period of time, once you know someone well enough, we see them kind of overlap and then suddenly start to go in different directions. So this is a chart of the bottom portion is like how well you know people. And then the top portion is how much you talk to them. And in America, we see us talk to, put a lot more effort into talking to acquaintances in like the early stages of a friendship. You put a lot of effort, a lot of work in. And then once you've kind of achieved that friendship status, we start to taper off and not put as much effort in because we're comfortable. Whereas it's pretty much the opposite in France. There's not a lot of effort to make new friends and to meet strangers on the bus and acquaintances. But once you're kind of at that friend level, the amount that you talk and the effort that you put in quickly increases. So that's just a clear difference between our two cultures. And again, Americans' communication style is dependent on level of education, social status, region of origin, age, other factors as well. And we're often characterized as friendly, welcoming, and open when it comes to common communication. And similar things contribute to how French people speak to one another. So like education level, social status, religion, region of origin, age, all of those things are going to contribute to how a French person communicates even so. But French people, like I said, are very direct. Tourists and outsiders often perceive the French as cold or rude because of this, but that is not the intention. And that brings us to like debate and compliments, which are a big part of how we build relationships. So debate, Americans love to argue anywhere, anytime, all over Facebook, in the classroom, on the streets, in the home. We're big fans of debate. And then compliments, Americans will most often accept a compliment with a thank you or some sort of, way that they're denying whatever it is that you're saying, because we really put a strong emphasis and value on like being humble, and accepting compliments can sometimes be perceived in the wrong way in our culture. Whereas it's slightly different in France. So with debate in France, French people don't often argue in public and find it to be generally unacceptable to do so. They do, however, enjoy structured debates. And then compliments with French people, they tend to appreciate compliments, but will almost always say no or deny it somehow rather than saying thank you. So kind of a similar there, but just a little bit step further in France than we are. And then formality is another big part of communication. So as a culture, Americans are very, very casual. Most parents will tell their children's friends to call them by their first name or Mrs. First Name, for example. We also don't have a formal version of you. So referring to someone as you is widely accepted even upon first meeting them, like, how are you? There's not, a more formal level of that pronoun. Whereas in France, formality is more important. Referring to someone as tu when first meeting them is often considered rude. So you want to use the formal vous. Even though vous is not like super commonly used in France, it's just considered like best practice, and it's polite to say, comment allez-vous, asking how are you, rather than saying comment ça va, which is a lot more casual way of saying how are you. And then we've got our nonverbal communication. So smiling, Americans smile at anyone they make eye contact with realistically. And oftentimes, if we smile at someone and they don't smile back, we're taken aback by that and find that to be rude. Whereas in France, they really don't do that. They don't smile at strangers as they pass by. They don't feel the need to. Going through these factors about French communication, it's like, that makes a lot of sense. Why do we have to smile at all the strangers on the streets? And then eye contact is important to both French people and Americans. It seems to hold slightly more weight in France. So eye contact with strangers can often be misunderstood as flirtation because it's usually saved for one-on-one conversations and business deals in France, whereas it's expected, often in America that you make eye contact with people that you're talking to. And then we have hand gestures. So placing the index finger under the eye and gently pulling down on the skin is a common way in which French people indicate they feel someone is lying. My French teacher used to use that gesture all the time. If somebody was like, oh, I left my homework in my locker, she'd be like, oh, I bet you did, which is kind of an interesting gesture. The thumbs up means the same thing in France and America. It means okay or good. Tapping the index finger on the tip of the nose is another common way that French people express that you're clever or witty or smart, on the nose. Another one that I saw my French teachers doing quite a bit when you got the question right on the nose. And then greetings, it's very common for French people to greet by giving a peck on each cheek. So usually left and then right. This is very uncommon in America. If you went in for a handshake and somebody kissed you on the cheek, you'd probably be taken aback by that. So that's not very common in America, but it is very common practice in France. And that is all I have for our contrastive analysis of French and English. So you can take a look at the handout that I have attached and provided to get kind of the spark notes of this presentation, the most important factors. But thank you for tuning in.